Good afternoon. My name is Gillian Balaban and I am Senior Coordinator Governance Relations at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym the GSSB, being held on 17 November 2022. This virtual meeting is being hosted from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded, and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB webpage, along with high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present today from the GSSB Secretariat are Bastian Butt, Chief of Standards, Elodie Cheney, Manager Standards, and Harold Powells, Director of Standards. We will now start with a roll call. Anna Nefedova.
Hello, present.
Thank you. Cordy LaRue.
Present.
Evan Harvey.
Present.
Julia Genuardi.
Present.
Kent Swift.
Present.
Kim Schumacher.
Present.
Laura Dana Carter.
Present.
Michelle Vassar.
Present.
Peter Colley.
Present.
Robin Leeson.
Present.
Ganga Charan Sharma.
Present.
Thank you. And Judy Koseski.
Present.
Thank you, everyone. GSSB members Joseph Martin and Jennifer Princing will join shortly, and Vincent Kong sent his apologies. I will now hand over to the Chair, Judy Koseski, to open the meeting.
Thank you very much, Jill. Just a quick correction. I've received word that Jennifer Princing has sent apologies. Can I just confirm that otherwise we will expect to have a quorum for today's decisions? Jill? Maybe we'll get an answer to that in a few minutes. Yeah.
Left myself on mute, of course.
Okay.
Yes, as long as Joseph joins in a short while, we will have quorum.
Very good. Okay. Right. Well, hopefully that will happen. We believe it will. So thank you, everyone. Welcome to the meeting today. We have quite a public comment period, so we have a longer discussion of that. We'll then have the approval of the exposure draft of the GSSB work program for the forthcoming period to put that out into the public domain for comment during, as part of the normal consultation process for the GSSB work program. Following the close of the public meeting, we will have a short time for a private session. Are there any questions or points that others would like to raise at this moment? Okay, if not, then I'm going to turn it over to Bastian to just give us the brief update from the Standards Division, please.
Thank you, Judy, and hello, everyone. Yes, as Judy has previewed, I will keep it very short today, also because we had the in-person meeting just a couple of weeks ago, and while the team is extremely busy and keeps getting busier, 4 weeks is then not something where there's fundamental change. But what I wanted to bring to your attention is that we keep adding capacity to the team over the last months, and that enables us to commence new projects that you have approved, start to look into some of the things that we basically have sitting there as projects to be implemented with the right level of capacity. Today, obviously, we have an important milestone on the biodiversity work. Elodie will speak to that in a moment. The colleagues that advance our mining sector standard are making great strides to bring this to your attention in one of the upcoming meetings for also a public consultation approval. On the labor project side, we're composing the group or advisory group, and we had more than 200 applications there, which is also in itself already an achievement. But more importantly, we have the right level of experts from the different constituencies and also geographies interested in working with us, and that is obviously always important. We have a second technical committee meeting coming up shortly as well. Maybe on the front of new things, the financial services sector standard project, we have done the background research already, but we're intensifying now also the outreach to stakeholders around that. I'm really looking to have conversations with key partners and experts to build towards announcing a group and soliciting for the 3 sector standards that form part of the portfolio project the right expertise. 2 colleagues are currently at the COP in Egypt. Judy has represented us there last week. Now the colleagues are there to network and build towards our work on climate. So we're trying to leverage this opportunity also to not only announce that we will be working in that space in a complementary fashion to the work of EFRAG and ISB, but importantly also find the right expertise and connections to work on the impact perspective for the climate issue. You will also see announcements, or have seen announcements in last weeks, and there will be more in the coming weeks on additional translations that become available. These are translations still for the full set of the standards after the universal standards have been approved. And I've reviewed this yesterday with Kari, who is overseeing the translations work that Ellen and Marta are implementing. And interestingly enough, we've now already reached the point that we mentioned earlier to you that more than half of the downloads that we see for the core product, for the GRI standards, are explained by language versions. I think that really speaks to the global nature of our collective work and how important it is to make it available in key languages. Lastly, I think I can say that the team continues to spend a significant time, and I would include also here, importantly, Judy in her role as the chair, to advance collaborations with the colleagues at EFRAG, but also the whole European standard setting effort, and the colleagues at the IFRS and the ISB in particular, so that there is significant time going into this as well. Along the lines of what we discussed at the in-person meeting, we're building to different moments there. For EFRAG next week, they will submit the final version of the ESRS to the Commission. For the colleagues at the ISSB, they start to lock in detail for the first 2 standards, and we have ongoing conversations on that. I think I leave it at that for today. Obviously, if there are questions emerging from what I just shared, then I'm available now to respond to the.
Any questions that anyone has for Bastian at this point?
And if not, then I suggest we go straight into the next substantive session.
I do agree with that.
Elodie.
Yeah. Why don't we turn it over, if Elodie is available, it's over to her to talk to us about the biodiversity draft.
Yes, and thank you, Judy, and good afternoon, everyone from the Netherlands. So I'm very pleased today to present the exposure draft of the revised biodiversity standard. And we can already move to the next slide. So we will start by looking at the process and the step taken to reach the stage we are at now. So the review of the GRI 304 was identified as a priority by the GSSB since the issue of biodiversity has received significant attention in the Global Sustainable Development Agenda in the recent years. The revision of GRI 304 aims to represent internationally agreed best practice and also to ensure alignment with recent developments and relevant authoritative intergovernmental instruments in the field of biodiversity. So the project proposal was approved by the GSSB in September 2021 after consultation with the GRI board and the Stakeholder Council. And moving to the next slide, you will see here that in November 2021, the GSSB appointed a technical committee of 18 members to provide guidance and recommendation in the revision of the biodiversity disclosures. You will see the affiliation here on the slide. I won't go through all of them. You can find the composition of the technical committee on our website. But you will see that it is composed of 4 business representatives, 5 members from the civil society, 2 members representing investment institution, 1 representative from the labor constituency, and 6 members from mediating institutions. In addition, the GSSB appointed 2 sponsors, Kim Schumacher and Michel Vacher, who attended most of the technical committee meetings as well. On the next slide, you will find an overview of the steps and interim milestone for the development of the exposure draft. And as I just explained, the project commenced in the 3rd quarter of 2021 through the approval of the project proposals and the appointment of the GSSB sponsors. And the content development started a couple of months later through the appointment of the technical committee. We had scoping survey and interviews with each members. And we had a first technical committee meeting in December 2021 to kick off the project with them as a group and to already discuss the outcome of the scoping survey. The technical committee met again in January of this year to further discuss the scope of the revised standard and to assess the disclosure from the 2016 disclosures from the current standard. We also established several subgroups who met several times between January and May to develop the different disclosures. We also had a couple of plenary meetings during that time with the whole technical committee meeting. We provided the first full draft of the standard to the TC for the review in May. Their comments helped us refine the content in a second draft. We shared an advanced version of that second draft to a small number of experts and organizations interested in the development of the biodiversity standard through a small field test during the summer months. And these participants represented business, investment institutions, and mediating institutions. So the second draft and the feedback from that field test was discussed with the technical committee in September. And from there, the draft was further revised. The standards division conducted a technical review and an editorial review, and the final draft was submitted to the technical committee for a final flow check. And a last meeting was held in October to resolve these final issues. So that brings us here. And on the next slide, I also want to inform you that through the technical committee, but also next to that engagement with the technical committee, we've been engaging with several initiatives, projects, instruments that have informed the revision of the biodiversity disclosures. And indeed, one particular aspect and sometimes challenging aspect of this project is that the authoritative instruments and the other frameworks that are relevant to the development of the content of these standards are being developed concomitantly at the same time that our own standard. And so that created a need for further outreach and making sure that we are keeping track of all these developments. So just to give an overview of some of the key ones, the ALIGN project is an EU-funded project led by the UNEP WCMC and the Capitals Coalition. They are represented in our technical committee, and they developed recommendations for principles and criteria for biodiversity measurement and valuation, with the aim that these recommendations will be included in disclosure frameworks and target setting to facilitate uptake by businesses. And in particular, it helped developing disclosure 304-3 on the changes to the state of biodiversity. the assessment and reports from IPBES, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, where instruments we rely on, in particular with regard to the direct drivers of biodiversity loss. We also have one technical committee member who is also on the IPBES Working Group on Business and Biodiversity. They will soon kick off a methodological assessment, so we also keep in touch there in the coming months. The International Finance Corporation Performance Standard 6 on biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of natural resources has also informed the content of the exposure draft. It is a standard that is in particular widely used by the extractive industry, and it's a source of information that helps with define the mitigation hierarchy and areas of high biodiversity value. So that supported in particular the development of a couple of disclosures, 304-1 and 304-5. Yeah, through our technical committee, we also have a representation of the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting Financials that provide financial institutions with practical guidance on biodiversity impact assessment, in particular through the use of footprinting tools. Importantly as well, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, so the CBD, is currently negotiating the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which includes commitments and targets for all relevant stakeholders to halt biodiversity loss by 2030 and achieve recovery of natural ecosystems by 2050. So the first draft was released in July 2021. It informed the development of our disclosures, in particular disclosure 304-6. And also the Nagoya Protocol, which falls under the umbrella of the CBD, has also informed the disclosure on access and benefit sharing of genetic resources. And also additionally, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, TNFD, and the Science-Based Target Network, SBTN, are also in the process of developing guidance and frameworks that will support businesses and investment institutions to integrate nature and biodiversity into their decision-making process. So we've had several exchanges with them directly. Several of our technical committee members are also involved in these initiatives. So that also informed the overall approach of our standards. Noting that it's still a work in progress. So the TNFD, the latest version of the TNFD framework was released a couple of weeks ago on the 4th of November. So just the day after we shared our exposure draft with you. In addition, several reporting standards and benchmarks were also developed and released during the project, notably the EFRAG ESRS E4 on biodiversity and ecosystems, which has just been approved by the EU. And we've had several exchanges with them throughout the process. CDPs in our technical committee, and the revised GRI disclosure is also informing the revision of their questionnaire. And finally, the World Benchmarking Alliance released a nature benchmark in March. We use that as well as an input, and we are also involved in their expert review committee, so allowing to share information and experience on a regular basis. So that's it for the context, and now moving on to the exposure draft itself. Yeah, so the exposure draft and its cover memorandum, by the way, is in item 1 in your meeting documents, in case you want to have it open next to you. And here first is a summary of the significant proposal in the exposure draft. So the revision aimed to facilitate reporting impacts across the supply chain. This was identified as one of the main gaps in our current disclosure by the technical committee. And they mentioned that reporting information on supply chains is a key, as most of the significant impact on biodiversity for many organizations is in their supply chains and not in their own operations. And therefore, a sole focus on an organization's activities could lead to underreporting or reporting or not reporting the impact that are the most significant ones. The draft, there is also a focus on the most significant impact on biodiversity. We do not require to report on all impact, and that is because identifying, measuring, reporting on all impact can be challenging, especially when taking into account the organization's supply chains. There is an emphasis as well on providing location-specific information on impacts. Impacts on biodiversity are site-specific. That was also a strong recommendation from the technical committee, and therefore an understanding of the local context where an organization interacts with biodiversity is necessary to assess its impact. And as I said, the TC mentioned that it is not possible to have meaningful information on an organization's impact without an understanding of that local context, and therefore without having location-specific data. And also that an organization cannot adequately manage its impact without having that understanding as well. So as a result, you will see that in the proposed exposure draft, disclosure 1 to 4 require information on a side-by-side basis. There are also new disclosures to report on the direct drivers of biodiversity loss and on the changes to the state of biodiversity, new requirements as well on the impact on people resulting from an organization's impact on biodiversity, and new biodiversity-specific management disclosure focusing on understanding how the organization applies the mitigation hierarchy to manage its biodiversity-related impacts and how it aligns its policies and commitments with the upcoming CBD post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And finally, we also have revised definitions and extended guidance. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Jill. Here we present an overview of the changes between the 2016 disclosures and the exposure draft. So in the exposure draft, the disclosure 304-1 covers and expands on the current disclosure 304-1 in GRI 304, while disclosure 304-2 on the direct drivers of biodiversity loss replaces what was covered by the requirement 304-2-A in the current GRI 304, and disclosure 304-3 on the state of biodiversity replaces what is covered by requirement 304-2-B and disclosure 304-4 in the current GRI 304. The disclosure 5 or 304-5 on the management of biodiversity-related impacts capture the content of what is currently under disclosure 304-3, habitat protected or restored, replacing and expanding quite significantly on that content by requiring information on the application of the mitigation hierarchy. All the other disclosures are new proposed additions. Next slide, please. So now I'll cover in a bit more detail the key elements proposed in each disclosure. So disclosure 304-1 provide information about the operational sites with the most significant impacts that include the sites of the organization itself and the sites of its suppliers. The organization is required to explain how it has determined those sites. It also requires the location, and that is the coordinates and the size of its own operational sites, and whether those sites are in proximity to area of high biodiversity value. And this disclosure also required information on the location, and that is the country or jurisdiction of its suppliers' operational sites. Disclosure 304-2 provides information about the activities responsible for the direct drivers of biodiversity loss, and those include climate change, invasive alien species, land and sea use change, overexploitation of resources and pollution. And here the TC recommendation was that climate change it needs to be treated differently, as it is a bit different than the other four, in the sense that it's global drivers of biodiversity loss. And that means that the emissions released by an organization on a particular site will not necessarily drive biodiversity loss in the vicinity of these sites, but they contribute to the global change in climate that drives biodiversity loss. So that is typically an example of cumulative impacts where the exact relationship between an organization's greenhouse gas emission and its impact on biodiversity cannot be drawn as a one-to-one relationship. And for this reason, and also to highlight the strong relationship between climate change and biodiversity loss, it is required to report on the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions at organization level, while for the other direct drivers, information is required at site level. Next slide, please. So disclosure 304-3 provide information about the biodiversity impacts resulting from the organization's activities and the activities of its suppliers. And for each site of the organization, information is required on affected ecosystems and affected species, while for the site of the suppliers, information is required on affected ecosystems. And for disclosure 304-4 on ecosystem services requires information about ecosystem services and beneficiaries affected by the organization and its suppliers.
Can I hold on just a second? I've got a hand raised.
I see, yeah, I was just looking at a comment.
Yes, Michelle, would you like to make a comment, please?
Preferably when Elodie has finished the presentation.
Okay. All right, fine. Thank you. Carry on.
It's just that since I was one of the sponsors, I would like to add a few words, but not at this stage. It's just some additional comments after, and
no
drawing your
problem.
attention on specific points.
Great. Thank you. Elodie.
Thanks. So carry on to the next slides. Here you have an overview of the last 3 disclosures proposed in the exposure draft, with disclosure 304-5 providing information on the actions taken to manage the organization's impacts and requiring information on the application of the mitigation hierarchy and information about the synergies and trade-offs related to the management of climate change and biodiversity impacts. Disclosure 304-6 provides information about the organization's policies or commitments to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity in line with the CBD's post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And finally, the last disclosure 304-7 provides information on how the organization respects the provisions set in the Nagoya Protocol regarding the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. And that disclosure will cover especially commercial and non-commercial research and development activities on the genetic and biochemical composition of genetic resources. So to give you an idea of activities that will be covered, that could be, for instance, animal and plant breeding, biotechnologies, cosmetics, food and feed, pharmaceuticals. And as we move to more and more to a green or circular economy where companies are looking at using more and more natural resources to design their product, that may cover more activities over time. The next slide, please. And finally, we propose a new term for inclusion in the glossary, which is ecosystem conversion. We have a slight amendment based on one of the GSSB feedback we received, but that will be covered in the next slide. And we also propose to remove the terms that are here on the slide as they are either no longer used or they have been included in the guidance of the disclosures. So that includes area protected, area restored, protected area, and significant impact on biodiversity. So next we can move on to the feedback received by the GSSB, unless Michelle, you would like to jump in now. I don't know if that's a good time.
Yes, that's a very good time. Thank you. So as you know, I was one of the sponsors of the work. My job was fairly easy in the sense that the standards division managed very well for me the whole process, including potential questions that the GSSB could have. And so outside of direct interactions that we sponsors regularly had with the standards division, I practically had to raise no questions during meetings with the technical committee. A second reason was that in the technical committee, there was another representative of the chemical industry who already was raising all the questions that I could think of. So I was more an observer. I wanted to attract your attention on the fact that I see this as the most demanding GRI standards ever prepared, mostly because, as you saw, disclosure are asked on a site-by-site basis and not at the organization level. And as far as I know, this is the first GRI standards that goes that far, including, by the way, asking information about location of impacts in the value chain. That makes it very demanding for industry, but the technical committee was very strong about it. And as a sustainability professional, I wonder if it's not the sense of history. If we think about greenhouse gases, the CDP has already been asking scope 1 and 2 emissions on a site-by-site basis in the CDP questionnaire. And the day organizations will really want to address scope 3 emissions, they will need information on scope 3 emissions based on primary data and not just on calculations. But so I really wanted to attract your attention on that. This makes it a very different standards from the previous ones which have already been prepared.
Thanks very much for that comment, Michel. That's very helpful. Elodie, any kind of reply or anything that you'd like to add to that at this point? For that matter, I would just like to acknowledge that Kim Schumacher is the other GSSB sponsor for this working group. So please do, if there's any additional context to be added onto Michel's views, please feel free.
On my end, for now, no, but I do think it is a good balancing act in terms of, I can also turn on. I do think it is a balancing act, and I do think considering where we are, and just to also say, I'm in the IP, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I'm a lead author for their next Nexus report. Yeah. And with that being said, I do think there's a balance to be struck, and I can attest to that. We definitely had very deep conversations also between Elodie and also with Michel when we were discussing the different aspects. But I do think where it is right now, I think it is a step in the right direction. And I think it also sets the stage for additional ambitions in the future. But I think in terms of raising the level of where biodiversity is in the corporate awareness mindset, I think it is a step in the right direction. And I think with every technical working group or so, did it achieve everything that everyone wanted? Probably no, but I do think it is definitely increasing the bar a significant level. So I think it is definitely a step in the right direction. I think it also, in terms of biodiversity, also with the COP15 right now on biodiversity, I think it is at the right time, and hopefully it can also get more more reporting, more granular reporting on biodiversity, so that also this very important topic, gets more like, more spotlight in the reporting space.
Thank you very much for that. Elodie, back to you.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you to Michelle and Kim, both for your comments today, but also for your support throughout the project. It was very much appreciated and also very helpful to us. And indeed, to echo what was said, it's a significant revision. We're really raising the bar, and we really try with the standards division to really test that approach with the technical committee, indeed, for the especially the side-by-side reporting, try to develop and test with them alternative to have more aggregated reporting. But I think the conclusion were very clear that this would not lead to meaningful reporting. So this is what we are proposing. As a result, I think we will also make sure we need to make sure that we communicate very clearly on on that, but also our organization can implement gradually our standards, for instance, with the use of risk information and these kind of things that people have time, or organization have time to improve their reporting over time. And I think that also need to be explained, not as to scare off people, and ensure the right uptake of this standard. And we also just as well to stress that that was also a approach that was strongly supported by all TC members, including business representative. And I think I've heard a couple of times one member mentioning it. For them, it was the even as a business representative, the future of reporting. So we'll see and we'll test that approach during the public comment, I guess now. Unless there's any further comment, maybe then we can stay on this slide to cover now the GSSB feedback that we received. So first of all, thank you for the feedback that you've provided. We'd like to cover some of those comments today. And this first one, where we have a slight adjustment to one of the requirements. So one member was looking for clarification on the definition of ecosystem conversion in the topic standard and natural ecosystem conversion in GRI 13, pointing that they draw on the same source, but there are some differences in the context of the two. And indeed, so natural ecosystem conversion, just to provide some context and some explanation. So natural ecosystem conversion is a well-accepted way to measure land use change, which is one of the direct drivers of biodiversity loss. And initially, with our discussion with the TC member, they recommended that so that ecosystem conversion is used to measure land use change, but that it should be broadened or to all ecosystem converted, but it's to all relevant ecosystems converted by companies' activities, as some of non-natural or those already ecosystem modified by human activities can contain a lot of biodiversity and could be relevant to consider. So that directed our initial approach to then use the term ecosystem conversion in the draft. We had many conversations with a subgroup that focus on this disclosure to test whether we should have two separate requirements covering this natural and modified ecosystem separately. Eventually, we came up with this version in this draft with this one requirement, as we have also guidance now that refers to the IUCN typology of ecosystem, which cover both natural and modified ecosystems. So in short, the idea was to extend the concept of natural ecosystem conversion, expand it to all ecosystems. And that also so in the last meeting with the technical committee, however, last month, when reviewing the proposed definition on ecosystem conversion, the group recommended that the TC recommended that we should actually keep the focus on natural ecosystems to keep the alignment with other framework, such as the Accountability Framework Initiative, which the definition is based on, the CDBs, the SBTN, and also keep alignment with their approach to measuring ecosystem conversion. And because this discussion happened late in the process, we haven't really had the opportunity to circle back with the technical committee to discuss the implication of that decision on the requirement that you see on the slide. But in effect, now based on the definition that they've agreed upon, this requirement covers natural ecosystem only. So we had amended in the draft that you saw, we had amended the guidance to ensure that conversion of modified ecosystems is covered as a recommendation. And also, if you look at the first draft of the post-2020 framework from the CBD, when they refer to the 2050 goals, they actually refer to natural ecosystems. So these also support a narrower focus of the requirement on natural ecosystems. You know, as pointed out by this feedback from the GSSB, there's a misalignment in the terminology that we use. So no longer in the concept, but in the terminology that we use with the GRI 13. So now we propose those changes that you see on the slide to make sure that there's no misalignment anymore. It's mostly an editorial change. It doesn't change the intent of the disclosure. And in addition to that, the term that would be included in the glossary then will be natural ecosystem conversion as opposed to ecosystem conversion. I'm just giving you a bit of time to read through this proposed change in case you have any comments or that you want to raise before we move on to the next slide.
I don't see any.
No, so yeah, seeing any, yeah, Jay, maybe we can move to the next slide. So the remainder of the GSSB feedback. So there was also a comment where GSSB members sought the inclusion of clarification on the inclusion of greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3. Wondering if emissions are material, then would not they be included in either sector standard or in the materiality determination of the reporter? Or is this only insofar as such emission impact on biodiversity? It would be helpful to understand the relationship between this disclosure and the expectation of applying the materiality principle. So here, as mentioned before, the climate change is indeed treated differently than the other drivers of biodiversity, as we cannot draw the direct connection between the organization greenhouse gas footprint and its impact on biodiversity. And therefore, the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of an organization are included as an indication of how the activities of the organization and its suppliers are responsible for biodiversity loss through climate change. However, it's true that the way the requirement is framed, all organizations need to report this information. Yet in our discussion with the technical committee, they indicated that for them, this information would already be reported by the organization. So that is that it would be very unlikely that an organization that has identified biodiversity as a material topic would not also have identified climate change as a material topic as well. So there's this assumption that's behind, but that is definitely something that is not clear in our current draft. So that's something, that's a topic or an issue that we definitely want to clarify with the TC as we finalize the draft post PCP, as there are a couple of options that we would like to investigate. But maybe at minima and for the purpose of the public comment, we would like to propose a small addition, and I'm sorry it's not written on the slide, but that would be to add a sentence in the guidance to explain that this requirement covers the greenhouse gas emissions of organizations that have determined climate change as a material topic, and that the organization can provide a reference to the information reported under GRI 304 to meet these requirements. So that at least the relationship with the materiality approach is clarified. And then after, we also had one question regarding the fact that disclosure 304-6 refer directly to the goals and target related to a specific convention, and a question asking whether there are implications for other topic standards. When you look at the current draft of the CBD post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, there are a specific or explicit mention to pollution, such as plastic pollution or pesticides, climate change, circular economy, though not in those words, but so indeed there could be possible implications. Currently, where there are interlinkages with topic standard, in particular, if you look at disclosure 304-2, we have referred to these topic standards in the draft. We also have a requirement on the trade-offs and synergies between the management of climate change and biodiversity impacts, as well to cover the interaction between these two topics that are, two crises that are fairly, very deeply interconnected. But indeed, these will also require close coordination, probably with a subsequent GRI project or topic standard project. And especially with the upcoming revision of the climate change disclosures, we know that we need to keep the ongoing conversation between the two projects to make sure that there are the right alignments there. There was also a question as to whether a navigation tool will be prepared. So a navigation tool between the exposure draft and the TNFD framework, draft framework, will be available as part of the public consultation period, and a suggestion as well to have a dedicated question during the PCP. We do not have a navigation tool in place yet. We are planning to have one when we release the final standard, and that is because the TNFD framework is still a work in progress. And as I said, they released the latest framework 2 weeks ago, so that leaves us a little time to develop such tool. But just to let you know, we have a session with TNFD next week. We will dedicate time with them to discuss the level of alignment between our respective documents, and in particular with a view to have also being able to have joint communications there, so we can explain where we're at in respect to how both initiatives interact and are aligned, and that will also help our communication through the PCP, but also and in particular during the COP15 in Montreal. So I mean, we need to see what the outcome of this discussion will be, but I can see that at minima that will help support specific FAQs that can provide that information for the time being, with a more detailed tool being developed for the release of the final standards. And then also, we also had a couple of other comments, just to say that we take into account, or we want, there was a comment to mention that there's no associated guidance to requirement 304-6-D to describe how the organization addresses the negative impacts of the transition to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity on workers and local communities. So that's, we take that under advisement, and that's something we would like to develop as we finalize the draft post PCP. And the reason being, this was put a bit on hold as we wanted to see how the Labour project was going to address the issue of transition. And also we need to do a bit more research on the right reference to use here. But that's something we are considering. And also, we also receive a question to clarify if the guidance of in 304-1, which define area of importance to indigenous peoples and local community, if we actually define those areas through dependence for livelihoods and area with recognized customary management. And here, just to clarify, the guidance mentioned that areas of importance for indigenous peoples and local communities are indeed those that support their livelihood, and these includes but are not limited to areas under customary management by indigenous peoples and local communities. But then we'll be looking, again, we can look at the draft or the language when we finalize the draft to make sure that this is clear, and maybe we can mention that in a bit more a language that is a bit more straightforward, I think, in the draft. So I will stop here, and I will, let the GSSB raise any comments, maybe, or questions that you may still have on the exposure draft.
I don't see any at the moment, Elodie. We do need to move to the approval to get through the agenda today. Any comments or questions? Peter, yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I just seek one point of clarification. Thank you very much for the presentations and the comments by Michelle and Kim. The issue of supply chain versus value chains. Michelle referred to value chain, but it seems clear to me from the reading of it that this standard seeks to restrict discussion of impacts to the supply chain, except that it does deal with scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions as a way of looking further at the value chain. And Michelle also explained that this draft standard is very demanding in terms of site-specific impacts, and that's probably the explanation for the focus on supply chain rather than value chain, but I thought that should be clarified.
Yes, I can give an answer directly to that. It's mostly because it's much more difficult to identify impact downstream compared to upstream.
Yes, indeed. And I think the role of the downstream value chain was also raised by the technical committee, but through our discussions, we realized that it will be too challenging to have it as a requirement. So you will see that the downstream entities are covered as options or recommendations in the disclosures for that reason.
Thank you.
Okay, so maybe given that we're probably taking a bit, we need to speed up a bit. So just checking if there are other questions or comments before we move to the approval.
Okay, I don't see any. I think we can probably move ahead, Elodie.
So then if we move to the next slide, please, Jill. I think then I need to hand it over to you, right, Judy, for the schedule approval.
Indeed, and we will just proceed with that. We are now on for the scheduled approval of the topic standard project for biodiversity exposure draft. We'll talk in a moment about what the exposure draft sort of looks like, and there's a little bit of sort of information around all of that. Can I ask now for the GSSB's approval of this exposure draft? And may I ask if there are any objections or concerns about this? Hearing none, that is approved. Thank you very much to everyone. Elodie, why don't you move ahead and tell us about the exposure draft period and so forth?
Yes, perfect. And just I know we're rushing or we're a bit behind schedule, but I just want to take a few seconds really to, well, thank you very much for this approval and recognizing that it's an important milestone for this project. And I just want to thank, of course, all the technical committee members who have been very engaged in the development of this exposure draft, and the standards division team, in particular, Izzy, Matthew, and Sharon for helping with drafting the disclosure, Harold with helping with external engagement, and the whole STNP team for your help and guidance with the technical and editorial review.
Here, so thank you very much for mentioning all of them, and I think we did hear from Michelle and Kim the support for the quality of the work that's been done on this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, it's been a great team effort. So, well, now that we have an exposure draft, as per our due process, we will release this draft for public comment. And the objective of this public comment is mainly to test the clarity, feasibility, completeness, and relevance of the exposure draft's content, and drive submissions mainly via online questionnaire to collect specific input and help us finalize the content. And if we move to the next slide here, You'll see the key dates, the PCP and the key events that we are planning. The PCP will run from the 5th of December from the 28th of February 2023. So for about 3 months, the document will be released on the 5th of December, therefore, just 2 days before the start of the Biodiversity COP in Montreal. We will have 2 global webinars on the 15th of December covering different time zones to present the draft. On the week of the 12th of December, we will also be at the COP, so we'll have a small but powerful GRI delegation to promote the public comment period as well for this draft. We are still finalizing the schedule of events, but we can report on the GSSB to that to provide more details later on. And then we'll have global Q&A events in January and February, taking into account that most of the Southern hemispheres might not be able to engage in January, or at least the first part of January, as in many places it is holiday seasons. We are planning regional events as well in Latin America, in Spanish and Portuguese, and also in Africa, to ensure that we have the right regional representation in the submissions, in particular as these 2 regions include some of the most biodiversity-rich areas on the planet. So next slide, please. You'll see, and that's my final slide, in item 2 of the meeting papers, you'll find the draft questionnaires that we're envisaging for the public comment. As already suggested by the GSSB, we will include a question on the interoperability with the TNFD, but if you have any additional feedback, please provide by next Thursday, 24th of November. And yeah, this concludes this presentation.
Thank you very much, Elodie. And just to repeat our thanks to the entire project working group, the GSSB sponsors, the whole of the standards division that put in a great deal of effort on this piece of work, which is a fantastic contribution to the biodiversity COP, and hopefully will give us some great content to engage our colleagues and stakeholders with over the months to come. So any feedback or suggestions on this, the format of the questions for the exposure draft, you have 1 week to send in any thoughts that you might have if you'd like to take a look at that before it goes out, and that will form the foundation for tracking the public comments. Okay, thank you so much. I think let's move straight in. We are a little bit behind schedule. Hopefully we won't shortchange the discussion of the work program. In fact, we won't. If we have to do anything, we'll simply truncate the private session a little bit, but hopefully we'll be able to get through all of this in a timely manner. Bastian, can you talk us through what we have to do now is to approve the exposure draft of our work program, which, as you know, has been under discussion quite a lot in recent meetings. We have an obligation under the due process to seek public input into the GSSB's work program, and that is what we are setting out to do now with this exposure draft. So, Bastian, over to you, please.
Thank you, Judy. And I think I want to echo what you just said around. We had ample discussion of the direction of this and the ambition behind it, in particular at the in-person meeting. And what the team now tried to do is to galvanize that into a succinct document and flag up all the activities that are relevant from a standard setting activity perspective. And I think importantly also to organize this in a way that the main areas of work are highlighted, and there is at least an indicative schedule for the elements of the program as far as we have locked in projects and activities at this point in time. But the idea being that stakeholders can actually pick up this work program, a look at, read through it, and get an idea of how the scaling of standard setting will translate into individual projects and activities, and how this is organized on a timeline. So I think that's one of the areas of work that we have paid particular attention to now in the last weeks after the in-person meeting. We move to the next slide. What is missing from the item 3 that has been shared with you is the preamble to the document, which in part had to be based on text that is under development in relation to collaborations that we will seek to intensify over the next 3 years. And then there is namely with AFRAC on the European standard setting, and the ISSB in relation to the global reporting regime that we're standing up together. I want to bring this specifically to your attention because it is part of the document that we're approving now. We did flag to you yesterday when sharing the slides that this was an element that was additional and new. I don't think I will read it out here, but I wanted to briefly walk you through the considerations here. These are 2 slides. The first one here covers an outline on what the GSB is aiming to accomplish, recognizing importantly the free public good nature of the standards, the comprehensive nature of the standards, and the focus on economy, environment, and people, and the impacts that organizations are having by virtue of their activities. We have highlighted the link with the instruments, the intergovernmental instruments, as an important feature, distinguishing feature, but also defining feature of the GRI standards. And we've put this also, what we're explaining here in terms of the ambition in context of recent achievements. So the release of the universal standards has really enabled us to now go deep into individual standards projects, as well as the successful conclusion of the pilot on the sector standards. And if we can go to the next slide, please. We were then juxtaposing this with the moment in time that we are in the evolution of corporate reporting, and we're flagging the collaboration that we have with the IFRS in particular, and look also to include the collaboration that we're having with them in the objective of this work program. Secondly, we're highlighting that when this work program is rolled out in full, we are looking to have a cycle of 4-year cycle for the review of the existing standards. This has been the ambition in the last work program. Now we have the resource to actually get to the capacity. So we felt that it is important to highlight that here. And last mentioning in this is in relation to the leadership position that you are taking as the GSSB, and the belief that it is really about standing up the blueprint. I think that's in keeping with the discussion that we had on biodiversity, that we stand up a leadership position and a programming that actually solidifies that the GI standards can be considered the blueprint for best practice on reporting on impacts, and that we're working towards that, acknowledging that it will always be also a consideration of reducing the overall burden to those that issue reports, and at the same time facilitate the necessary dialogue on corporate impacts. So I think this is what I wanted to outline here, just as considerations that go into the preamble. Any questions about this?
Doesn't look like it. Thank you, Bastian.
Good. Then we move to the next slide. We are on a slightly different schedule compared to the public consultation period that was outlined by Elodie just now. We are starting next week, but we are also acknowledging the holiday period in parts of the world, and that cuts across our mandatory 60 days. So we've now put the end date of the public consultation to the 17th of February. Looking there to bring together the feedback over the course of the 3 to 4 weeks after, before we have to post our consolidated feedback and also the analysis of the standards division for your deliberations for an in-person meeting. And we will, for those that pay attention here to the wording, also you see a 2-day meeting in March. That is something we are putting forward, and we will acknowledge also in the private session when we look at administrative detail. So a 2-day meeting in March where we can then approve the final version of this work program. Next slide. I did not plan to highlight particular sections of the work program now, but I know that all of you had the chance to go through the text in advance of the meeting. Is there anything that we would need to look at in more detailed formulations that you've come across that you would like to understand better or see changed in the document? Then this is the moment before we move to the approval.
Thanks, Bastian. Let's also just acknowledge that when we do go for public comment and exposure on the work program, there are always additional ideas that are surfaced, you know, from members of the public or from collaborating organizations and so forth. So it's not the end of the story, and as you know, the execution of the work program is itself an ongoing kind of work in progress. You know, over the course of 2 or 3 years, we will make decisions about prioritizing things. We will continue to seek input that can help to inform decisions that we might make about development of standards or revision of existing standards. And of course, there's the ongoing collaborative discussions that we have with the likes of FPRAG and with the ISSB and other organizations that will need to be, as always, taken into consideration in the actual, you know, sort of putting into practice of the work program as it is ultimately formulated, regardless of what we have drafted for public comment at the moment. So are there any points of discussion, concerns, comments, things people would like to add? Okay, well, in that case, I put it to the GSSB that we'd like to approve this draft work program for exposure, and barring any comments to the contrary, then we will take it as agreed by the GSSB. I'll just pause for a moment. Joseph Martin, please go ahead.
Hi, good evening to all. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Okay, so just one statement at the last paragraph of the preamble, that GSSB will try to reduce the burden of the reporters, which I believe is a bit negative statement. I would prefer to make it more positive, like make it optimize the efforts of the reporters. Will be a more appropriate preamble, I think.
Okay, I think that's a reasonable comment. Bastian, are you happy to tweak the language slightly around that?
Of course, we can look at that. Yes.
Well, thank you, Joseph. Are there any other final points to be raised? Okay, hearing none, thank you very much. That is approved. So thanks again. We're going now to publish this draft work program and look forward to the public feedback that we receive from it. If I'm not mistaken, Bastian, we have now picked up time that we seem to have lost in the earlier discussion. Yes. Please. What's after this? Do we have anything at all after this?
No, I think on the public section of the meeting, this is where we close. But maybe this is a good moment to ask whether there's anything else that should be discussed on public record before we move into the administrative session.
Okay, I'm not hearing anything. Maybe I'll just point out that one of the things that we'll just flag in the private session, but will enter the kind of public record quite soon, is a proposal for GSSB meetings in 2023. Those will, once they're agreed, once it sort of works with diaries and we get the arrangements in place, then those will be made public on the GSSB website, both in person and virtual for 2023. Anything else to raise in the public meeting? Okay, well then it just remains for me to thank everyone for their time today and their participation. Thank you for all of your attention, GSSB members, to these important developments that we've been able to take the next step on today. And to those of you with connection problems, for managing to hold our quorum for those votes. That's very helpful of all of you. And thank you for your ongoing support. We'll look forward to speaking at the next meeting in December. And until then, wish you the best. And we will close the public meeting now and stay on with GSSB members for a short private session.